So, what I'd like us to do today is just go through this passage and point out what this passage says our actions and our attitudes at work should be like, whether we are in authority or under authority. Let's start with what this passage calls bondservants. That's the word in verse 5. However, this original Greek word is also sometimes translated slaves. Paul read out of the New King James translation this time, where it was translated bondservant. In the 1612 Authorized King James Version of the Bible, and many subsequent further translations and editions, it is often translated as just servant. It's rather interesting to note in the version that was read to us, in verse 8 it translates exactly the same word that's within the phrase whether he is a slave or free as bondservant, because they were forced to translate it that way because of course that phrase was meant to be showing the contrast between being in slavery or being free. So we can't approach this passage without it bringing up the whole issue of slavery and what the Bible has to say about slavery. Does the Bible promote slavery? I would say absolutely not. Well then, what does the Bible say if it's not promoting it? What exactly is going on here? The emergence of Christianity was primarily a religious revolution, not a social revolution. Though it's worth noting that it has caused a few social revolutions over the years. Our modern view of slavery is one that has been formed through the abomination of slavery as witnessed in America prior to the American Civil War, or the African slave trade that was promoted and exploited mainly by European countries up until the abolitionist movement inspired by the likes of William Wilberforce came along in the 18th and 19th century. I would simply like to point out that it was Christians who first freed the slaves, and that process started in England among evangelical Christians many years ago and spread throughout the world and to the United States, who in fact fought a civil war over that issue. But I would also point out that slavery still exists in some parts of the world, but it does not legally exist in any Christian culture or society. Now, in the Old Testament period, a form of slavery or bonded labour existed at that time, but it is a long way off what we have come to recognise what the slave trade in Europe and America represented and was like. If God's word had been followed, then that modern version of the slave trade would never have been allowed. In the Old Testament law, Israelites could only end up in slavery for one of two reasons. One because of debt, and the other was because of crime. In the event of financial problems or debt, an individual could voluntarily sell themselves into slavery to avoid the repercussions of their situations affecting their wider family. In the other situation, a criminal could be placed in the courtesy of a master who would reimburse the victim of that person's crime. And those in that type of slavery could only be forced to work a maximum of 6 years, after which they had to be freed. However, sometimes they could stay on as part of the extended family, but that was usually by agreement. Old Testament law also provided protection for those held in this type of bonded service, protected them from overly oppressive masters, and they were only allowed, whilst within that bonded labour or slavery, they were only allowed to work a maximum of 6 days out of 7, with the Sabbath of course being a rest day. So the type of slavery seen in the Old Testament can't really be compared to what we would recognise as the African slave trade. Now in the New Testament, the version of slavery that was witnessed was one of that of the Roman slavery system, and that was seen across the entire Roman world. And it is acknowledged in the New Testament as the status quo at that time. It was the status quo throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, Christianity was the first major religion to proclaim that all individuals were made in the image of God. And by declaring that, I believe you can reasonably say that God had put his law in men and women's hearts that they could now know the difference between right and wrong, and not only on this issue but on many others. The New Testament scriptures also recognize that maybe slavery could and should be done away with, and it absolutely says that if a slave had an opportunity to be free, then they should take it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 21 says this: "Were you a while a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain freedom, do so." So the New Testament does not promote slavery. It says it's a social phenomenon that exists at that point in history. It never says slavery in itself is a desirable institution, or even that it should be perpetuated. And the slavery that existed in Great Britain and Europe, and also in America, was an entirely different type of slavery than the one that Paul is addressing here. You see, in European and American history, slavery was a racial issue, but in the first century of the Roman Empire, it was not a race-based system, it was an economic system. When the Romans conquered a country, they reduced some of the people to slavery. You see, some conquered people who were owned were highly educated and intelligent people, and they were often given authority, the whole estate of a Roman master. So when Paul says bondservant in Ephesians chapter 6, he's talking about slaves, yes, but this wasn't the same as what a slave was prior to the Civil War in America, or what we see and witness prior to the European Enlightenment in the European countries exploiting the African subcontinent.